Thank you for listening. This is such a deep topic, I had to break it into two parts. I am releasing part 2 with this. Picture a small farmhouse in Harmony, Pennsylvania. It's 1829, and inside one of its modest rooms, something extraordinary is supposedly taking place. A young man, just 23 years old, sits at a table with his face buried in a hat. Not just any hat, but a hat containing a smooth, chocolate-colored stone about the size of an egg. This is Joseph Smith, Jr., and he's been sitting like this for hours. His voice rings out steadily, dictating words in a rhythmic cadence. Sitting across from him, a schoolteacher named Oliver Cowdery writes frantically, his pen scratching across page after page. They've been doing this day after day, and Oliver's hand must be cramping. In the next room, Joseph's wife Emma can hear every word. She's gone in and out throughout these sessions, brought them meals, observed the process. What she's never seen, what no one in that room is looking at, are the golden plates themselves. Oh, they're allegedly there, wrapped in a linen cloth on the table, or sometimes tucked away in another room entirely. The plates that an angel supposedly delivered to Joseph. The ancient record inscribed in Reformed Egyptian that contains the history of ancient peoples in the Americas. The whole reason for this endeavor. But nobody's looking at them. Joseph's face stays in the hat, pressed against the opening to block out the light. He stares at that stone, the same stone he used for treasure hunting, searching for buried Spanish gold in the hills of New York. The same stone that got him hauled into court just 3 years earlier on fraud charges. Now that stone is revealing Scripture. This is how the Book of Mormon is being created. Not through careful scholarship, not through studying ancient languages, not even by looking at the plates themselves. A face in a hat, a seer stone, and words flowing out at an astonishing rate. In just 65 working days, Joseph Smith will dictate over 275,000 words this way. That's more than 4,000 words per day. No notes, no revisions, just straight dictation, start to finish. The entire book, the founding scripture of what will become one of America's most successful religious movements, produced in a little over 2 months. Some will call it a miracle. Others will call it the most audacious fraud in American religious history. But before we can understand how this book came to be, we need to understand the man behind it. Who was Joseph Smith? How does a poor farm boy with minimal education become the prophet of a religion that today claims over 16 million followers worldwide? How does a convicted con man transform into a religious leader whose followers believe he spoke directly with God? To answer that, we need to go back to the beginning. To understand Joseph Smith, we need to understand where he came from, the world he grew up in, and the path that led him to that farmhouse in Pennsylvania with his face in a hat, dictating what he claimed was ancient scripture. This is the story of Joseph Smith and the Mormon Church. A story of visions and revelations, of golden plates and seer stones, of polygamy and power, of doctrine that changes when convenient, and of a religious empire built on foundations that don't hold up under scrutiny. Let's begin. To understand Joseph Smith, you first need to understand the world he grew up in, a place and time unlike anything we experience in modern America. The early 1800s in upstate New York was a spiritual pressure cooker. The region stretching from Albany to Buffalo became known as the Burned-Over District, a name that tells you everything you need to know. It had been swept over by so many religious revivals, so many waves of evangelical fervor, that it was said to be burned over like a forest after a wildfire. There was nothing left to kindle. This was the heart of the Second Great Awakening, a massive religious movement that transformed American Christianity. Circuit-riding preachers set up tent revivals in every town. Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, and dozens of other denominations competed fiercely for converts. Camp meetings could draw thousands of people, working them into religious frenzies with hours of preaching, singing, and emotional testimonies. But it wasn't just mainstream denominations. The Burned-Over District was a breeding ground for new religious movements. The Shakers were there, practicing celibacy and ecstatic dancing. The Millerites predicted the end of the world would come in 1844. The Oneida community practiced complex marriage, essentially religious communism with shared spouses. Spiritualist movements claimed to communicate with the dead. If you wanted to start a religion in early 19th century America, this was the place to do it. The region was perfect for religious experimentation for several reasons. It was recently settled. People had few established social ties, no deep roots. The Erie Canal brought an influx of migrants and new ideas. Economic instability meant people were searching for meaning and hope. And the democratic spirit of the new republic meant that religious authority was up for grabs. You didn't need to be ordained by an ancient institution. In America, anyone could claim direct communication with God. Into this spiritual marketplace, where prophets were a dime a dozen and visions were common currency, the Smith family arrived. Joseph Smith Jr. was born in 1805 in Sharon, Vermont, the fifth of 9 children. His family was poor, persistently, generationally poor. His father, Joseph Smith Sr., was a failed farmer who moved the family constantly, always one step ahead of creditors, always chasing the next opportunity that would finally bring prosperity. But the Smiths weren't just poor farmers. They were deeply involved in something that most people today don't associate with Christianity: folk magic. In the early 1800s, especially in rural areas, folk magic and Christianity weren't seen as contradictory. People went to church on Sunday and consulted divining rods and seer stones during the week. The line between religion and magic was blurry at best. Joseph Smith Sr. was a rodsman. He used a divining rod to search for underground water, buried treasure, and lost objects. This wasn't unusual. Lots of people believed in this practice, but the Smith family took it further than most. They believed in treasure seeking. According to folk belief, the hills of New England and New York were full of buried treasure, gold and silver left by Spanish conquistadors, pirate loot, or riches hidden by ancient civilizations. But these treasures were protected by enchantments. They would slip away into the earth if you didn't approach them correctly, if you didn't have the right magical protections. Joseph Smith Sr. had visions. His wife, Lucy Mack Smith, wrote about one of his dreams involving a tree of life and different paths, imagery that would later appear in the Book of Mormon. Lucy herself came from a family of religious seekers, always looking for the true church, never quite satisfied with existing denominations. Young Joseph Jr. grew up in this environment, absorbing these beliefs. By his teenage years, he had discovered his own gift, or so he claimed. He found a seer stone. The story goes that in 1822, when Joseph was 16 or 17, he was digging a well for a neighbor named Willard Chase. 20 feet down, he found a smooth, dark stone. When he looked into it, he claimed he could see things, hidden treasures, lost objects, things happening far away. This wasn't his only seer stone. He would eventually have several, but this brown, chocolate-colored stone would become his favorite. And it's the same stone, remember this, that he would later use to translate the Book of Mormon. Joseph began hiring himself out as a money digger or glass looker. Farmers and neighbors would pay him to use his stone to find lost property or buried treasure. He'd put the stone in a hat, put his face in the hat to block out the light, and tell people what he saw. The Smith family participated in multiple treasure hunting expeditions. They would dig at night, draw magic circles, sacrifice animals, all the rituals believed necessary to obtain enchanted treasure. They never found anything, but the belief persisted. The treasure always slipped away at the last moment, or they didn't perform the ritual correctly, or someone broke the spell by speaking. This is the world Joseph Smith came from, not a world of biblical scholarship or theological training, but a world of folk magic, treasure hunting, and seer stones. This is crucial to understanding what comes next. By 1825, 20-year-old Joseph Smith's reputation as a seer had spread. A farmer named Josiah Stowell from South Bainbridge, New York, heard about Joseph's abilities and hired him. Stowell was convinced there was a Spanish silver mine on his property, and he wanted Joseph to use his seer stone to find it. Joseph moved to the area and spent months treasure hunting for Stowell. He boarded with the family of Isaac Hale, where he met Hale's daughter, Emma. Joseph and Emma began courting, much to Isaac Hale's displeasure. Hale thought Joseph was a fraud and didn't want this treasure-hunting con man anywhere near his daughter. The situation came to a head in March 1826. Joseph was brought before a justice of the peace in Bainbridge, New York, on charges of being a disorderly person and an impostor. The trial records, and there's been debate about these records, but multiple sources confirm the basic facts, show that Joseph was accused of fraudulently obtaining money through his treasure-seeking activities. Josiah Stowell himself testified, admitting that Joseph hadn't actually found any treasure, but insisting he believed in Joseph's abilities anyway. Joseph took the stand. According to the court record, he admitted to having a seer stone. He admitted to looking into it and telling people what he saw, but he claimed he had given up the practice, that it had become tiresome, that he couldn't really see things in the stone anymore. The outcome of the trial is disputed. Some records suggest he was found guilty, others that charges were dismissed. But what's not disputed is that Joseph Smith was legally charged with being a fraud in 1826, specifically for the same practice, using a seer stone, that he would employ just 3 years later to produce the Book of Mormon. Think about that timeline. In 1826, Joseph is in court defending himself against fraud charges for treasure hunting with a seer stone. In 1829, that same stone in that same hat becomes the instrument through which he claims to translate ancient scripture. Isaac Hale remained unconvinced. But Emma believed in Joseph. Despite her father's objections, she eloped with Joseph in January 1827. They were married by a justice of the peace and moved back to the Smith family property in Manchester, New York. It's there, just a few months later, that Joseph Smith's story takes its dramatic turn. It's there that he claims an angel appeared to him. It's there that he says he was shown golden plates containing an ancient record. It's there that everything changes. But the question remains, was this a genuine religious experience, or was this the same con artist who'd just been in court for fraud, now finding a more lucrative mark? Let's look at the claims Joseph began making and see if we can find an answer. The foundational event of Mormonism, the moment that justifies everything that follows, is called the first vision. According to official Mormon teaching, this is when God the Father and Jesus Christ appeared to 14-year-old Joseph Smith in a grove of trees in upstate New York. The official version goes like this. It's spring of 1820. Young Joseph is troubled by the competing claims of different churches. Which one is right? He reads James 1:5 in the Bible. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, and decides to pray for guidance. He goes into the woods near his family's farm, kneels down, and begins to pray. Suddenly he's seized by a dark power, as if some evil force is trying to destroy him. Just when he's about to give up, a pillar of light appears above him, brighter than the sun. 2 personages descend in this light. One points to the other and says, "This is my beloved Son. Hear him." Jesus Christ then tells Joseph that he must join none of the existing churches because they're all wrong. Their creeds are an abomination. Their professors, meaning their ministers, are corrupt. The true gospel will be restored through Joseph. This is the story every Mormon missionary tells. It's taught in primary classes to Mormon children. It's the foundation of the church's claim to authority. The great apostasy, the falling away from true Christianity, had occurred, and God chose Joseph Smith to restore the true church. There's just one problem. Joseph Smith told this story multiple times, and the versions don't match. The official version I just described comes from an account Joseph wrote in 1838, 18 years after the event supposedly happened. But that's not the first time he told this story. The earliest written account we have is from 1832, just 12 years after the alleged event. And it's dramatically different. In the 1832 version, Joseph is 15 or 16, not 14. He doesn't go to the woods confused about which church to join. He already knows they're all wrong. He's seeking forgiveness of his sins. And here's the crucial difference. Only one personage appears to him. Joseph identifies this figure as Jesus Christ. There's no mention of God the Father appearing separately. No mention of 2 distinct personages. Why does this matter? Because Mormon theology is built on the idea that God the Father and Jesus Christ are separate, distinct beings with physical bodies. This was Joseph's great theological innovation, rejecting the Trinity doctrine that most Christians believe. But in his earliest account of the foundational vision, he only sees one being. In 1835, Joseph told the story again to a visitor named Robert Matthews. This time there are two personages, but they're not clearly identified as the Father and the Son. And now there are also many angels present. The account says the heavens were opened and Joseph saw many angels. The official 1838 account removes the angels entirely and clearly identifies the two personages as God the Father and Jesus Christ, two separate physical beings. This version wasn't even published until 1842, 22 years after the event. There are other versions too, each with slight variations in details, age, motivation, and who appeared. Now, defenders of Joseph Smith will say these are just different perspectives on the same event, that witnesses of any event might emphasize different details when retelling it. But these aren't minor details. The number of divine beings who appeared, one or two, is fundamental. Whether Joseph already knew all churches were wrong or was seeking guidance is fundamental. Whether angels were present is significant. And here's what's perhaps most troubling. If this was the most important event of Joseph's young life, the moment God himself appeared, why did he wait 12 years to write it down? Why do the accounts grow more elaborate over time? There's another issue. We have no contemporary evidence from 1820 that Joseph told anyone about this vision. His own mother, Lucy Mack Smith, wrote a detailed history of the family. She doesn't mention the first vision. It's not in there. The earliest anti-Mormon accounts from the 1830s, written by people who knew Joseph and wanted to discredit him, don't mention it either. If Joseph had been going around saying God appeared to him in 1820, his critics would have used that against him, but they didn't because apparently no one knew about it yet. The first vision becomes central to Mormon identity only later, as Joseph develops his theology and needs a foundational moment of divine calling. It appears to be a narrative that evolved over time, growing more specific and more aligned with Mormon theological distinctives as those doctrines themselves developed. This matters because if the first vision didn't happen, or didn't happen the way the official account says, then the entire foundation of Mormon authority crumbles. Joseph's claim to be a prophet rests on God choosing him to restore the true church. Without that divine calling, he's just another religious entrepreneur in the burned-over district. But let's set that aside for now and look at Joseph's next major claim, the one that produces actual physical evidence, the golden plates. According to Joseph Smith, on the night of September 21st, 1823, an angel appeared in his bedroom. The angel identified himself as Moroni, a resurrected being who had lived in ancient America. Moroni told Joseph about a book written on golden plates buried in a hill near the Smith farm. These plates, Moroni explained, contained an account of ancient peoples who had inhabited the Americas. They were written in Reformed Egyptian, a language unknown to scholarship then or now. Along with the plates, Joseph would find the Urim and Thummim, two stones set in a breastplate that would allow him to translate the ancient text. Moroni appeared to Joseph 3 times that night, repeating the same message. The next day, exhausted, Joseph went to the hill, now called Cumorah, and found the stone box containing the plates, exactly where the angel said they'd be. But Moroni wouldn't let him take them. Not yet. Joseph would have to wait 4 years, meeting with the angel once a year on the same date, before he'd be allowed to retrieve the plates. Why 4 years? Joseph never really explained that, but it conveniently meant that his claims couldn't be verified until 1827. Finally, on September 22, 1827, Joseph retrieved the plates. He described them as being about 6 inches wide, 8 inches long, and roughly 6 inches thick, a stack of thin metal plates bound together with 3 D-shaped rings. Each plate was thinner than tin, with engravings on both sides. The whole thing weighed between 40 and 60 pounds. Here's an immediate problem. If these plates were made of gold and were the dimensions Joseph described, they would weigh approximately 200 pounds, not 40 to 60. Some have suggested they were an alloy, tembaga, a gold and copper mixture used in pre-Columbian America. But Joseph consistently called them gold plates, and the witnesses described them as having the appearance of gold. Joseph brought the plates home, wrapped in a cloth, and the trouble began. He claimed that wicked men were constantly trying to steal them. He had to hide them repeatedly, in a hollowed-out log, under the hearth, in a barrel of beans. He moved them from place to place to keep them safe. But here's the strange thing. No one was allowed to see them. Joseph kept them covered. Even his wife Emma, who lived in the same house, who handled them while cleaning, never saw them uncovered. She described hefting them, feeling their weight, tracing the engravings through the cloth with her fingers. But she never saw them. The Urim and Thummim, the interpreters, apparently didn't work out. Instead, Joseph used his old seer stone, the same chocolate-colored stone he'd used for treasure hunting, the same stone involved in his 1826 fraud trial. His translation method was bizarre. He would put the seer stone in the bottom of a hat, his favorite hat, probably the same one he'd used for treasure hunting. Then he'd put his face deep into the hat, pressing it against the opening to block out all light. In the darkness of the hat, words would appear on the stone, glowing. He'd read them out loud, and his scribe would write them down. The golden plates themselves? Often in another room, or wrapped in a cloth on the table. Emma confirmed this. Oliver Cowdery, his primary scribe, confirmed this. Multiple witnesses described this process. Joseph wasn't looking at the plates. He was looking at a stone in a hat. He'd dictate a line. The scribe would read it back. If it was correct, the words would disappear from the stone and new ones would appear. If incorrect, they'd stay until the scribe got it right. This is why, Joseph explained, there could be no errors. The stone wouldn't move forward until everything was perfect. Martin Harris, his first scribe and financial backer, was skeptical. In 1828, he begged Joseph to let him take some of the translated pages, 116 pages, to show his wife, who thought Joseph was defrauding them. Joseph was reluctant but finally agreed. Martin lost them, or his wife destroyed them. Accounts vary, but 116 pages of the translation disappeared. Here's the critical moment. If Joseph was actually translating from physical plates using divine power, couldn't he just retranslate those same pages? Wouldn't a genuine translation produce the same text? But Joseph didn't do that. Instead, he said God was angry with him for trusting Martin. God wouldn't let him retranslate the lost portion because wicked men might have altered the pages to make him look like a fraud. They'd compare his new translation to the altered version and claim it didn't match. Instead, God provided an alternative. Joseph would translate from a different part of the plates, the small plates of Nephi, which covered the same historical period but from a different perspective. Conveniently, this meant he'd never have to reproduce the lost pages. Think about what this means. If Joseph was actually translating from physical plates, the text should be reproducible. Ancient writings don't change. But if Joseph was making it up as he went, he couldn't reproduce the lost pages because he didn't remember exactly what he'd said. The small plates of Nephi solution gave him a theological excuse for why the replacement text would be different. After the Martin Harris debacle, Oliver Cowdery became the primary scribe in April 1829. Over the next 65 working days, Joseph dictated the entire Book of Mormon, over 275,000 words. That's more than 4,000 words per day, with no revision, no notes, no backtracking. Either an extraordinary feat of memory and creativity, or exactly what he claimed, divine translation. The process was witnessed by Emma, Oliver, and others. They all testified that this is how it happened. Face in hat, words appearing on stone, direct dictation. But there's a problem. When the church tells this story to investigators and new members, they show pictures of Joseph studiously examining the golden plates, perhaps with the Urim and Thummim spectacles nearby. They don't show Joseph with his face in a hat, ignoring the plates entirely. That image doesn't appear in church artwork, even though it's the historically accurate description. Why? Because it sounds absurd. It sounds like exactly the kind of folk magic Joseph had been practicing for years. It's the same methodology that got him arrested for fraud in 1826. The church didn't even officially acknowledge the face in a hat method until 2015, when they published it in one of their gospel topics essays on their website. For nearly 200 years, They let members believe Joseph translated by studying the plates, when the historical record clearly shows he did nothing of the kind. But Joseph knew people would be skeptical. He needed witnesses. He needed people who could testify they'd seen the plates, that this wasn't just his imagination or his con game. So he arranged for witnesses, 11 men who would sign statements saying they'd seen the golden plates. The problem is, their testimonies fall apart under scrutiny. There were 2 sets of witnesses, the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses. The 3 witnesses were Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, and David Whitmer. Their testimony is printed in the front of every Book of Mormon ever published. It says they saw the plates, they heard the voice of God declaring the translation was correct, and they saw an angel who showed them the plates. That sounds compelling. 3 men, jointly testifying to a miraculous experience. Surely they wouldn't all lie or be deceived. But look closer at what they actually said later in life. David Whitmer, in an 1887 interview, clarified what he meant by seeing the plates. He said he saw them with the eye of faith, not with his natural eyes. He compared it to seeing a city through a mountain, a spiritual vision, not a physical one. The interviewer pressed him, asking if the table the plates sat on was physical. Whitmer said the table was as a table, meaning it was part of the vision, not physical furniture. Martin Harris was even more problematic. He was known for being incredibly unstable, religiously speaking. After leaving the Mormon church, he joined the Shakers for a while, then the Strangites, a Mormon offshoot, then several other groups. When pressed about the plates, he said things like, "I did not see them as I do that pencil case, yet I saw them with the eye of faith. I saw them just as distinctly as I see anything around me, though at the time they were covered over with a cloth." Covered with a cloth. Even in his visionary experience, he didn't see them uncovered. One witness who interviewed Harris reported that he was so spiritual-minded that he would see visions while talking with people. Harris was prone to visions. He claimed at various times to have seen Jesus in the shape of a deer, to have walked and talked with Jesus in the form of a deer for 2 or 3 miles, and to have fought with the devil who appeared as a jackass. This is one of the 3 witnesses, a man who saw visions constantly and who later admitted his vision of the plates was spiritual, not physical. Oliver Cowdery was the most involved, being Joseph's primary scribe. But he too eventually left the church after disagreements with Joseph, particularly over polygamy. He was excommunicated in 1838. Though he rejoined the church before his death, during his years away, he didn't actively promote the Book of Mormon or Joseph's prophetic claims. All 3 of the 3 witnesses eventually left the church. All 3 had serious conflicts with Joseph Smith, yet none of them fully recanted their testimony about the plates. Defenders say this proves it was real. They left the church, but maintained they'd seen the plates. But critics point out that admitting fraud would have been admitting they'd been con men themselves. They'd promoted the book, testified to thousands of people, built their identities around this experience. To recant completely would have been to admit they'd been fools or frauds. The spiritual vision explanation let them maintain some dignity while acknowledging they hadn't seen physical plates the way most people understand seeing. The 8 witnesses, Christian Whitmer, Jacob Whitmer, Peter Whitmer Jr., John Whitmer, Hiram Page, Joseph Smith Sr., Hiram Smith, and Samuel H. Smith, have an even simpler testimony. They say Joseph showed them the plates, they hefted them, they saw the engravings. Nothing about angels or voices of God. Just a straightforward claim of handling physical plates. But notice something. 4 of them are Whitmers, 3 are Joseph's immediate family, and 1 married into the Whitmer family. These aren't independent witnesses. They're Joseph's relatives and close associates, people who had everything invested in his success. Several of them also later left the church. And some, years later, signed a statement saying they'd been pressured to sign the original testimony, that they'd never actually seen or handled any plates. Here's the bottom line. 11 men signed testimonies saying they witnessed the golden plates. But those testimonies, when examined closely, are far less compelling than they first appear. Some describe spiritual visions rather than physical objects. Some later suggested they'd been pressured. All were closely connected to Joseph, family members, or financial backers who had everything to lose if the project failed. And conveniently, after the translation was complete, the angel Moroni took the plates back. They're not available for inspection. We only have the testimony of these 11 men, men who were either related to Joseph, financially invested in his success, or prone to spiritual visions. No one else ever saw them. No scholar examined them. No metallurgist tested them. They appeared from an angel, were hidden under cloths and wraps for a few years, and then disappeared back into heaven. All we're left with is the Book of Mormon itself. And that book, as we'll see, has some serious problems. The Book of Mormon presents itself as an ancient historical record translated from plates written between approximately 600 BCE and 421 CE. Let me give you the basic narrative. Around 600 BCE, a Jewish prophet named Lehi has a vision warning him that Jerusalem will be destroyed. God commands him to take his family and flee into the wilderness. They eventually build a ship and sail across the ocean to the Americas, which the book calls the Promised Land. Lehi's family splits into two main groups. The Nephites, descended from Lehi's righteous son Nephi, keep the commandments and maintain their civilization. The Lamanites, descended from the rebellious sons Laman and Lemuel, reject God and are cursed with dark skin. Yes, you heard that right. The book explicitly states that God cursed them by making their skin dark as a mark of their wickedness. These two nations grow into vast civilizations. The Nephites build cities, establish governments, and keep detailed records on metal plates. They have wars, prophets, and elaborate religious systems. They're waiting for the coming of the Messiah. Then, after his resurrection, Jesus Christ appears in the Americas. He ministers to the Nephites, establishes his church, and brings a golden age of peace. This is one of the book's central claims, that Jesus visited the Americas and that Christianity existed in the New World before European contact. But eventually, the Nephites fall into wickedness. The Lamanites grow in power. Around 385 CE, there's a final, catastrophic battle at a place called Cumorah. The Nephite civilization is completely destroyed, hundreds of thousands killed. Mormon, one of the last Nephite prophets, has been keeping the records. He compiles the history onto golden plates. Before he's killed, he gives these plates to his son, Moroni. Moroni adds a few final sections and then buries the plates in the hill Cumorah, where they'll remain hidden for 1,400 years until Joseph Smith digs them up in 1827. The book claims the Lamanites, the dark-skinned people, are the principal ancestors of the Native Americans. This is crucial. For most of Mormon history, the church taught that Native Americans were literally descended from these ancient Israelites. So that's the story. Ancient Jews sail to America, establish civilizations with millions of people, have wars with steel swords and chariots, raise horses and cattle, grow wheat and barley, and eventually destroy themselves in a massive final battle, all before Columbus arrives. It's an epic story. The problem is, none of it happened, and we can prove it. Let's start with the anachronisms, things that appear in the Book of Mormon that simply didn't exist in the ancient Americas. Horses. The book mentions horses repeatedly. The Nephites and Lamanites use horses. But horses were extinct in the Americas for over 10,000 years before Europeans reintroduced them in the 1500s. There were no horses in the Americas during the time period the Book of Mormon describes. None. This is not disputed by any archaeologist or paleontologist. The same goes for cattle, oxen, sheep, goats, and swine. The book mentions all of them. None of them existed in pre-Columbian Americas. Steel and iron. The book describes Nephites using steel swords, particularly the sword of Laban, which is a central artifact in the narrative. But metallurgy in the ancient Americas didn't include steel. They worked with copper, gold, and some bronze. Not iron, not steel. Chariots. The book mentions chariots multiple times, but pre-Columbian Americans didn't use the wheel for transportation. They had no beasts of burden large enough to pull chariots, and the terrain wasn't suitable for wheeled vehicles. Archaeological evidence shows no wheeled transport in ancient America. Wheat and barley. Mentioned as crops, the Nephites grew. But these were Old World crops, not present in the Americas until European contact. Silk. The book mentions silk production. Silk production requires silkworms, which are native to China, not the Americas. These aren't minor details. These are fundamental elements of the civilization the book describes, and every single one is anachronistic, something that didn't exist in the time and place the book claims to describe. Mormon apologists have tried various explanations. Maybe horses means deer, maybe steel means obsidian, maybe chariots means sleds or litters, but these are desperate retrofits. The book says horses, steel, and chariots because Joseph Smith in 1829 was describing civilizations the way he understood them, with all the elements of 19th century agrarian society. Then there's the King James Bible problem. This one's harder to explain away. The Book of Mormon contains extensive quotations from the Bible, particularly Isaiah and the Sermon on the Mount. Not just the same ideas, but word-for-word identical passages from the King James Version, which was translated in 1611. Here's the issue. The King James translators made specific choices, used specific archaic language, and occasionally made translation errors. Those exact same choices, that same archaic language, and those same errors appear in the Book of Mormon. For example, Isaiah chapters 2 through 14 appear almost verbatim in the Book of Mormon. But here's the problem. Biblical scholars date parts of Isaiah to after 600 BCE, which means they were written after Lehi supposedly left Jerusalem with his plates. How did texts that hadn't been written yet end up on plates Lehi brought to America? Even more problematic, the Book of Mormon includes italicized words from the King James Version. In the KJV, words are italicized when the translators added them for clarity. They're not in the original Hebrew or Greek. But those added words show up in the Book of Mormon too. Why would an ancient American record, originally in Reformed Egyptian, contain English words that were added by 17th century translators? The book also includes the phrase Alpha and Omega from the Greek alphabet, applied to Jesus. But the record was supposedly written in Reformed Egyptian and translated from golden plates. How did Greek letters end up there? And then there's the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus supposedly delivers essentially the same sermon in the Americas that he gave in Galilee, with nearly identical wording from the King James Version. Not just the same teachings, but the exact same peculiar 17th century English phrasing. This is exactly what you'd expect if Joseph Smith was composing the book in 1829, using the Bible he knew, the King James Version, as source material. It's not what you'd expect from an ancient record translated from Reformed Egyptian. Then there's the 19th century theology embedded throughout the book. The Book of Mormon addresses debates that were raging in Joseph Smith's time and place. Infant baptism. Should babies be baptized? There's a whole section arguing against it, which happens to align with Joseph's Baptist influences. The nature of the Trinity. Are the Father and Son the same being or separate? The book initially seems to support traditional Trinitarian theology, but later becomes more ambiguous as Joseph's theology evolved. The book also reflects 19th century American concerns about the origins of Native Americans. Where did they come from? Popular theories in Joseph's time suggested they were descended from the lost tribes of Israel. The Book of Mormon essentially canonizes that folk theory. It addresses anti-Masonic sentiment that was huge in upstate New York in the 1820s, with villains using secret combinations, basically Masonic-style secret societies, to gain power. It even mirrors the language and structure of contemporary religious texts. A book called The Late War Between the United States and Great Britain, published in 1816 in New York and written in King James-style English, has remarkable stylistic and linguistic similarities to the Book of Mormon. Both use the phrase, "it came to pass," excessively, a phrase that appears 1,381 times in the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon reads like a 19th century text because it is a 19th century text. It contains 19th century anachronisms, quotes from a 17th century translation, and addresses 19th century theological debates. This is not what an ancient American record would look like. But perhaps the most definitive evidence against the Book of Mormon's historical claims comes from DNA analysis. Remember, the book claims that the Lamanites are the principal ancestors of Native Americans. For over 150 years, the Mormon Church taught this as literal truth. Missionaries told Native Americans they were descendants of the Lamanites, that they were part of the House of Israel, that the Book of Mormon was their ancestral history. The introduction to the Book of Mormon, written by the church and printed in every copy, stated explicitly that the Lamanites are the principal ancestors of the American Indians. Then, DNA testing became sophisticated enough to trace ancestral origins. And the results were unambiguous. Native Americans are descended from Asian populations who migrated across the Bering Land Bridge between Siberia and Alaska approximately 15 to 20,000 years ago. Their DNA markers are East Asian and Siberian. There is no detectable Middle Eastern DNA in Native American populations. None. If millions of Israelites had come to the Americas around 600 BCE and their descendants had become the Native Americans, even if they'd mixed with existing populations, there would be DNA evidence. We can trace much smaller population movements than that. But there's nothing. No genetic markers linking Native Americans to ancient Israel. No genetic evidence of Middle Eastern ancestry. This isn't controversial among geneticists. It's not debated. The evidence is conclusive. Native Americans are not descended from ancient Israelites. The church quietly responded to this problem in 2006 by changing the introduction to the Book of Mormon. The phrase principal ancestors was changed to among the ancestors. A subtle change, but significant. They went from claiming these ancient Israelites were the main ancestors to suggesting maybe they were just some minor group among the ancestors. But that doesn't fix the problem. We still have no DNA evidence for any Middle Eastern ancestry in pre-Columbian Native Americans. And the Book of Mormon clearly describes vast civilizations with millions of people, not some tiny isolated group. Mormon apologists have tried to salvage this by proposing the limited geography model, suggesting that maybe the Book of Mormon events only happened in a small area in Central America, and maybe the Israelites were absorbed into existing populations so thoroughly that their DNA signature disappeared. But this contradicts the Church's historical teachings in the text of the book itself, which describes continent-wide civilizations. The DNA evidence is devastating because it's objective. You can't reinterpret it or spiritualize it. Either Native Americans have Middle Eastern ancestry or they don't. The science says they don't. So we have a book claiming to be ancient history that contains anachronistic animals, plants, metals, and technology. It quotes extensively from a 17th century English Bible translation, complete with translation errors. It addresses 19th century theological debates, and its central historical claim that ancient Israelites became Native Americans is directly contradicted by genetic evidence. Every objective measure we can apply to the Book of Mormon suggests it's not an ancient record at all. It's a 19th century creation, produced by a man with minimal education but considerable creativity, drawing on the Bible he knew, the folk beliefs of his time, and his own theological innovations. But Joseph Smith didn't stop with just producing the book. He was building a movement, and that movement was about to face its first major crisis, even as it was just getting started. The Church of Christ, later renamed the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was officially organized on April 6, 1830, with 6 founding members. But it grew rapidly. Joseph Smith was charismatic, the Book of Mormon was compelling to believers, and the burned-over district was full of people searching for religious truth. By 1831, the church had relocated to Kirtland, Ohio, where a group of converts offered them a new home. The Mormon community grew to several thousand. They built their first temple, an impressive structure that still stands today. For a few years, things looked promising. But Joseph Smith wasn't content with just spiritual leadership. He wanted to build an economic kingdom as well. In 1836, Joseph and other church leaders founded the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company. I say anti-banking company because they couldn't get a charter to operate as an actual bank. The state of Ohio denied their application. So they called it an anti-banking company and operated as a bank anyway, issuing their own currency. This was during a period of wildcat banking in America, where all kinds of questionable financial institutions were popping up. But the Kirtland Safety Society was particularly reckless. They issued far more currency than they had assets to back. Joseph Smith promised revelation from God that the institution would succeed and grow. Members were encouraged to invest heavily. It collapsed within a few months. The Panic of 1837, a major economic depression, was the final blow. The bank failed catastrophically. People lost their life savings. Joseph and other church leaders were accused of fraud and illegal banking. Lawsuits piled up. Joseph did what he'd done before when legal trouble came. He fled. In January 1838, he escaped Kirtland in the middle of the night and headed to Missouri, where other Mormons had already established settlements. But Missouri was not welcoming. The Mormon community there had been growing, and tensions with non-Mormon settlers were escalating. The Mormons voted as a bloc, which threatened to give them political control of entire counties. They were largely from the North and opposed to slavery, which made them enemies in a slave state. They claimed the land was their inheritance from God, which didn't sit well with people who'd already settled there. Conflicts erupted into violence. Mormons and Missourians attacked each other's settlements. There were battles, burnings, murders on both sides. The Mormon militia, called the Danites, engaged in retaliatory raids. On October 27, 1838, Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs issued Executive Order 44, which stated, "The Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public peace." That word, exterminated, made it infamous. It became known as the Mormon Extermination Order. 3 days later came the Hans Mill Massacre. A militia attacked a Mormon settlement, killing 17 people, including children. Joseph Smith and other leaders were arrested and charged with treason. Joseph spent months in Liberty Jail, where he wrote letters that later became part of Mormon scripture. Eventually, Joseph and the other leaders escaped, or more likely, were allowed to escape, because Missouri just wanted them gone. The Missouri Mormons fled east to Illinois, refugees once again. Illinois welcomed them. The state was happy to have Mormon votes, and they granted Joseph Smith's new settlement extraordinary powers. In 1839, the Mormons purchased land on a bend in the Mississippi River and established the city of Nauvoo. And this is where Joseph Smith's ambitions reached their peak. Nauvoo grew explosively. Within a few years, it rivaled Chicago as the largest city in Illinois, with a population approaching 20,000. The Mormons built another temple, even more impressive than the one in Kirtland. But Nauvoo wasn't just a city. It was a theocracy, a kingdom with Joseph Smith at its head. The Nauvoo Charter, granted by the Illinois legislature, gave the city unusual autonomy. Joseph became mayor. He was the chief judge of the municipal court. He was the lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion, a private militia that grew to over 2,000 armed men. He was the president of the church, which owned most of the property. He consolidated religious, political, military, and economic power in his own hands. Joseph even established the Council of 50, a secret governing body that was supposed to be the political kingdom of God. They discussed establishing an independent nation, possibly moving west beyond United States territory. Minutes from the council meetings show they symbolically crowned Joseph as king. This wasn't just a prophet leading a church. This was a man building an empire. And during this period, Joseph introduced what would become Mormonism's most controversial practice: polygamy. The exact timeline is debated, but evidence suggests Joseph began practicing plural marriage as early as the mid-1830s. By the time they were in Nauvoo, it was widespread among the church leadership, though kept secret from most members and from the outside world. Joseph received a revelation, later canonized as Doctrine and Covenants, section 32, commanding the practice. The revelation stated that plural marriage was necessary for exaltation, the highest degree of heaven. It used Old Testament prophets as examples. Abraham, David, Solomon had multiple wives, so it must be acceptable to God. The revelation also contained a threatening message to Joseph's wife Emma. It said that if she didn't accept plural marriage, she would be destroyed. If she refused to consent to Joseph taking additional wives, God would give Joseph other women even without her approval. Emma hated polygamy. The historical record shows she fought against it, accepted it briefly, then fought against it again. It was a source of tremendous pain in their marriage. Joseph married at least 30 women, possibly more than 40. Some were teenagers. Helen Mar Kimball was 14 when Joseph married her. Some were already married to other men, a practice called polyandry. He married mothers and daughters, pairs of sisters. He used his prophetic authority to convince young women and their families that it was God's will. The practice was kept secret. Joseph publicly denied it, even as he was privately practicing it. Church publications denounced rumors of polygamy as lies spread by enemies. But behind closed doors, the inner circle knew, and the web of secret marriages grew. This created a culture of secrecy, lies, and manipulation. Men who knew about polygamy were sworn to secrecy. Women who entered plural marriages couldn't tell their friends or family. The whole community was divided between insiders who knew the truth and regular members who believed Joseph's public denials. Eventually, this secret couldn't hold. By 1844, not everyone in Nauvoo was happy with Joseph Smith's leadership. Some insiders had become disillusioned, particularly with polygamy and Joseph's accumulation of power. William Law had been one of Joseph's most trusted counselors, serving in the first presidency. But he turned against Joseph when he learned about polygamy and what he saw as Joseph's abuse of power. Joseph had even approached Law's wife, Jane, proposing a plural marriage. Law refused and left the church. Law and other dissidents, former insiders who knew the secrets, decided to expose Joseph. They established a newspaper called the Nauvoo Expositor. On June 7, 1844, they published a single issue. The Expositor laid it all out, Joseph's polygamy, with specific names and details. His consolidation of political and religious power, his establishment of what they called a theocracy, his manipulation of followers. They called for reform, for a return to the original principles of the church, for an end to what they saw as Joseph's tyranny. It was devastating precisely because it came from insiders. These weren't enemy lies from outsiders. These were men who had been in the inner circle, who could provide specific evidence. Joseph's response was swift and catastrophic. 3 days later, on June 10th, Joseph convened the Nauvoo City Council. As mayor, judge, and military commander, he controlled all branches of government. The council declared the Nauvoo Expositor a public nuisance and ordered it destroyed. That same day, the city marshal, acting under Joseph's orders, led a group to the Expositor office. They smashed the printing press, destroyed the type, and burned all copies of the newspaper they could find. This was an unambiguous violation of freedom of the press. It didn't matter whether what the Expositor published was true or false. The First Amendment protected their right to publish it. Joseph Smith, wielding government power, had shut down a newspaper by force. The incident exploded across Illinois. The Expositor's publishers fled to Carthage, the county seat, and filed charges. Joseph was accused of inciting a riot. Warrants were issued for his arrest. Non-Mormon Illinois citizens were outraged by the destruction of a printing press. This was exactly the kind of tyranny America had rebelled against. Joseph declared martial law in Nauvoo and called out the Nauvoo Legion. He gave a speech to the militia saying, "Will you stand by me to the death?" They roared their approval. For a moment, it looked like there might be open warfare between Nauvoo and the rest of Illinois. But Joseph's support began crumbling. The Illinois governor demanded he submit to arrest. Joseph initially fled across the Mississippi River, planning to head west, but his brother Hiram and others convinced him that fleeing would doom the church. Reluctantly, Joseph returned. On June 24th, Joseph and Hiram Smith surrendered to authorities in Carthage. They were charged with treason, a capital offense, for declaring martial law and calling out the militia against the state. They were held in Carthage jail, with minimal security. The situation was tense. Joseph knew he was in danger. He smuggled in a pistol, a six-shooter that a friend passed to him. On the afternoon of June 27, 1844, a mob with blackened faces stormed the jail. There were only a few guards, and they offered little resistance. Possibly they were complicit. The mob rushed up the stairs. They fired through the door of the room where Joseph and Hiram were being held. Hiram was hit immediately and killed. Joseph, John Taylor, and Willard Richards tried to defend themselves. Joseph fired his smuggled pistol through the door into the mob. He hit 3 men, but the mob kept firing. Joseph was hit multiple times. He ran to the window and either fell or jumped out. He landed below, severely wounded, and the mob shot him again. Joseph Smith died at the age of 38. The church would later tell the story as a martyrdom, an innocent prophet murdered by a mob. And it's true that Joseph was killed by a mob, which is never justified. But the church's version usually omits that Joseph had destroyed a printing press, declared martial law, called out a militia, and was firing a pistol at his attackers when he died. This wasn't a lamb going to slaughter. This was the violent end to a man who had been accumulating power and making enemies for years. The destruction of the expositor had been the final straw, but the tensions had been building for a long time. Joseph Smith's death could have been the end of the Mormon movement. Many religious movements don't survive the death of their charismatic founder. But Mormonism was different. It had built infrastructure, community, and a theology that could continue. The question was, who would lead it? And that question would split the movement in ways that continue to this day. When Joseph Smith died in June 1844, he left no clear successor. He'd held multiple titles: president of the church, president of the high priesthood, trustee in trust, mayor of Nauvoo, lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion, and king of the Council of 50. But he hadn't formally designated who should inherit all that power. The result was chaos. Within weeks, multiple men came forward claiming the right to lead. Each had a different argument, a different basis for their authority, and the Mormon community, shocked and grieving, had to decide who to follow. Sidney Rigdon had been Joseph's first counselor in the first presidency. He argued that he should be appointed guardian of the church until Joseph's son, young Joseph Smith III, who was only 11 years old, could grow up and take his rightful place. Rigdon claimed he'd had a vision where this was revealed to him. He was in Pittsburgh when Joseph died, but rushed back to Nauvoo to make his claim. James Strang produced what he said was a letter from Joseph Smith, written just days before his death, appointing Strang as his successor. Strang claimed that an angel had ordained him and shown him buried plates, echoing Joseph's own story. He attracted a significant following and eventually established a community on Beaver Island in Lake Michigan, where he was crowned king. Yes, literally crowned with a crown. The Strangite movement survived for years before collapsing after Strang was assassinated in 1856. There were others too. Lyman White claimed authority to lead a group to Texas. Alpheus Cutler formed his own church. William Smith, Joseph's brother, claimed he should lead because of family ties. The movement was fragmenting, but the most significant claim came from Brigham Young. Young didn't claim to be Joseph's successor as prophet. He didn't claim to have Joseph's prophetic gifts or to receive revelations the way Joseph had. His argument was organizational. He was the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. And according to church structure, the 12 had authority to lead the church when the first presidency was dissolved. Brigham Young had something the others didn't: organizational control. He had the loyalty of the 12. He controlled church finances. He had been the one organizing the missionary work that had grown the church internationally. He was pragmatic, administrative, a builder rather than a visionary. On August 8, 1844, there was a crucial meeting in Nauvoo. Sidney Rigdon spoke first for an hour and a half, making his case to be guardian. Then Brigham Young stood up. According to many accounts, though historians debate how many of these accounts were created or embellished later, something remarkable happened. People said that when Brigham spoke, he sounded like Joseph. He looked like Joseph. It was as if Joseph's mantle had literally fallen on Brigham's shoulders. This transfiguration of Brigham Young became a powerful story in Mormon lore. Whether or not anything supernatural happened, Brigham was a powerful speaker and he had the organizational machinery behind him. When the vote was taken, the majority supported the 12 apostles with Brigham as their head. Sidney Rigdon was excommunicated shortly after. He formed his own church, which never gained much traction. James Strang took a significant portion of members with him, maybe several thousand, but his movement eventually collapsed. Most of the splinter groups faded into obscurity, but one group that rejected Brigham Young's leadership would become significant: Joseph Smith's own family. Emma Smith, Joseph's widow, refused to go west with Brigham Young. She stayed in Nauvoo. She remarried and lived out her life there, maintaining until her death that Joseph had never practiced polygamy, either lying to protect his legacy or in deep denial about what she knew to be true. Joseph Smith III, the prophet's eldest son, eventually organized what became the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the RLDS Church, now called Community of Christ. They claimed that Joseph III was the rightful successor through lineal descent. They rejected polygamy, rejected much of the temple theology that developed in Utah, and took a very different path. This created a fundamental split in Mormonism that continues today. The Utah Church, the LDS Church headquartered in Salt Lake City, represents the Brigham Young succession and is by far the largest Mormon denomination, with over 16 million members. Community of Christ, headquartered in Independence, Missouri, represents the Emma and Joseph III succession and has about 250,000 members. They've diverged so much theologically that they barely recognize each other as related anymore. But in 1844, none of this was settled. Brigham Young had won the succession battle in Nauvoo, but he knew they couldn't stay. Illinois had turned against them. The violence that killed Joseph could easily flare up again. And Brigham had a vision for something Joseph had dreamed about: a Mormon kingdom in the West, beyond the reach of the United States government. In February 1846, with Illinois authorities threatening to arrest Mormon leaders and with anti-Mormon violence increasing, the exodus began. The first groups crossed the frozen Mississippi River, heading west into Iowa territory. It was a brutal migration. Thousands of people, entire families, left their homes and property behind, often selling at devastating losses. They traveled in wagon trains through Iowa in the mud and rain, establishing temporary camps. Many died of exposure, disease, and malnutrition. This was not a well-planned exodus. This was a desperate flight. The main body of Mormons spent the winter of 1846-47 at winter quarters near present-day Omaha, Nebraska. Hundreds died there from disease and harsh conditions. They buried their dead and prepared for the final push across the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains. Brigham Young led the first pioneer company of 148 people, 143 men, 3 women, and 2 children, westward in April 1847. They followed the Oregon Trail for part of the way, then branched off to find their own destination. They were looking for a place so isolated, so uninhabitable, that no one else would want it. A place where they could build their kingdom without interference. On July 24, 1847, Brigham Young entered the Salt Lake Valley. According to tradition, he declared, "This is the place." Whether he actually said those words is debated, but it's become central to Mormon pioneer mythology. The valley was part of Mexican territory at the time. They were literally leaving the United States. Ironically, within a year, the Mexican-American War ended, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ceded the territory to the United States. The Mormons had fled to Mexico only to find themselves back under U.S. jurisdiction. But they were isolated. The Salt Lake Valley was harsh, a desert with limited water, extreme temperatures, and poor soil. But it was vast, and it was empty. The Mormons could build their Zion here. Over the next decades, tens of thousands made the journey. The church organized handcart companies, poor converts, many from Europe, who couldn't afford wagons and pulled handcarts by hand across the plains. Some of these companies were caught in early winter storms and suffered catastrophic losses. The Willie and Martin handcart companies in 1856 lost over 200 people to starvation and freezing. But they kept coming. Brigham Young organized the migration with military precision. He established settlements throughout the territory, eventually over 300 towns across what would become Utah, Idaho, Nevada, Arizona, and surrounding states. It was one of the most successful colonization efforts in American history. And in this isolated kingdom, Brigham Young built a theocracy that would have made Joseph Smith proud. Brigham Young led the Mormon Church for 33 years, from 1844 until his death in 1877. He didn't have Joseph's charisma or visionary creativity, but he was an effective administrator and an authoritarian leader. And he taught some doctrines that were radical even by Mormon standards, some of which the church has since disavowed. The Adam God doctrine is the most bizarre. Brigham taught in multiple sermons in the Salt Lake Tabernacle that Adam, the Adam from the Garden of Eden, was actually God the Father, not symbolically but literally. Adam was God. He came to earth with one of his wives, Eve. They produced children, and Adam was the father of Jesus Christ, both physically and spiritually. This directly contradicted what Joseph Smith had taught and what the Book of Mormon said about God. It confused even faithful Mormons at the time, but Brigham insisted it was true. He taught it publicly for years. The modern LDS Church disavows the Adam-God theory. They call it Brigham's speculation or opinion, even though he taught it from the pulpit as doctrine. This raises an uncomfortable question for Mormons. If the prophet can teach false doctrine as revelation for decades, how do you know current prophets aren't doing the same? Then there was blood atonement. Brigham taught that some sins were so serious that Christ's atonement on the cross wasn't sufficient to cover them. For these sins, murder, adultery, apostasy, the sinner's own blood had to be shed to atone. Not just capital punishment for murder, but actual religious execution for apostasy and sexual sin. Brigham said explicitly, "There are sins that men commit for which they cannot receive forgiveness in this world or in that which is to come. And if they had their eyes opened to see their true condition, they would be perfectly willing to have their blood spilt upon the ground, that the smoke thereof might ascend to heaven as an offering for their sins." Whether this was ever actually practiced is debated. Some historians believe that some murders in early Utah were blood atonement killings. Others say it was just rhetoric. But the doctrine was taught publicly and created a culture of fear. The most enduring and damaging of Brigham's doctrines was the priesthood and temple ban on black members. Brigham Young taught that black people were cursed with dark skin because of actions in the premortal life. Specifically, they had been less valiant in the war in heaven, the premortal battle between Christ and Satan. As punishment, they were born with dark skin and denied the priesthood. In Brigham's words, "Cain slew his brother, and the Lord put a mark upon him, which is the flat nose and black skin." He went further. "Shall I tell you the law of God in regard to the African race? If the white man who belongs to the chosen seed mixes his blood with the seed of Cain, the penalty, under the law of God, is death on the spot. This will always be so." This wasn't just denying black men the priesthood, which in Mormonism is necessary for salvation and exaltation. This was teaching that interracial marriage should be punished by death. Under Brigham's leadership, black members couldn't hold the priesthood, couldn't participate in temple ordinances, couldn't be sealed to their families for eternity, and couldn't achieve the highest degree of heaven. At best, they could be servants to white Mormon families in the afterlife. This policy would last until 1978, well into the civil rights era, long after it was indefensible. We'll talk more about that later, but it originated with Brigham Young, and it caused immeasurable harm. And then there was polygamy. Under Brigham, plural marriage went from a secret practice among the elite to public doctrine required for exaltation. In Utah, far from federal oversight, the Mormons openly practiced polygamy. Brigham Young himself married 55 women and had 56 children. Other church leaders had multiple wives. It became a public badge of righteousness. The more wives, the more righteous you were. In 1852, the church publicly announced the practice. Apostle Orson Pratt gave a sermon in the Salt Lake Tabernacle defending plural marriage from the Bible and Book of Mormon. It was published and distributed. The secret was out. The federal government was not pleased, and over the next 40 years, the fight over polygamy would nearly destroy the church. But before we get to that, we need to talk about the darkest moment of this era, the Mountain Meadows Massacre. On September 11, 1857, a group of Mormon militia and their Paiute allies attacked a wagon train of emigrants from Arkansas passing through southern Utah. Over the course of several days, under a flag of truce, they massacred approximately 120 men, women, and children. Only small children, too young to testify, were spared. This wasn't random violence. This was an organized military action by Mormons in positions of authority. The massacre happened during a period of tension called the Utah War, when the federal government was sending troops to Utah to assert control. Brigham Young had declared martial law and was preaching resistance. Whether Brigham Young ordered the massacre is debated. He certainly created the environment that made it possible. He preached blood atonement. He preached that enemies of the church should be destroyed. He talked about taking vengeance for the deaths of Joseph Smith and the persecutions in Missouri. The church tried to cover it up, blaming it entirely on the Paiutes. It took 20 years before anyone was prosecuted. John D. Lee, a local Mormon leader who participated, was eventually executed by firing squad in 1877. He claimed he was a scapegoat, that he'd acted under orders from church authorities. On the execution ground, his last words were, "I have been sacrificed in a cowardly, dastardly manner." The Mountain Meadows Massacre remains one of the most shameful episodes in Mormon history. The church took 150 years to place a monument acknowledging Mormon responsibility at the site. This was the era of Brigham Young: authoritarian control, strange doctrines, racial discrimination, and violence. The Mormon kingdom in the desert was not the Zion of peace and righteousness that the hymns described. It was a theocracy built on some very dark foundations. But the federal government was about to force changes that would transform Mormonism forever. In February 1846, with Illinois authorities threatening to arrest Mormon leaders and with anti-Mormon violence increasing, the exodus began. The first groups crossed the frozen Mississippi River, heading west into Iowa Territory. It was a brutal migration. Thousands of people, entire families, left their homes and property behind, often selling at devastating losses. They traveled in wagon trains through Iowa in the mud and rain, establishing temporary camps. Many died of exposure, disease, and malnutrition. This was not a well-planned exodus. This was a desperate flight. The main body of Mormons spent the winter of 1846 to 47 at winter quarters near present-day Omaha, Nebraska. Hundreds died there from disease and harsh conditions. They buried their dead and prepared for the final push across the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains. Brigham Young led the first pioneer company of 148 people, 143 men, 3 women, and 2 children, westward in April 1847. They followed the Oregon Trail for part of the way, then branched off to find their own destination. They were looking for a place so isolated, so uninhabitable, that no one else would want it, a place where they could build their kingdom without interference. On July 24, 1847, Brigham Young's company entered the Salt Lake Valley. According to tradition, sick with mountain fever and riding in the back of a wagon, Brigham looked out over the valley and declared, "This is the place." Whether he actually said those words is debated by historians, but it's become central to Mormon pioneer mythology. July 24th is still celebrated in Utah as Pioneer Day, a state holiday bigger than the 4th of July. The valley was part of Mexican territory at the time. They were literally leaving the United States. Ironically, within a year, the Mexican-American War ended, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ceded the territory to the United States. The Mormons had fled American jurisdiction only to find themselves back under it, but they were isolated. The Salt Lake Valley was harsh, a desert with limited water, extreme temperatures, and poor soil. The first winter was brutal. Crops failed. They survived on scarce rations, wild game, and eventually ate their pack animals and boiled hides for food. But they persisted. Over the next decades, tens of thousands made the journey. The church organized the migration with military precision. Brigham Young established the Perpetual Emigrating Fund, using church resources to loan money to poor converts so they could make the journey, with the expectation they'd repay once settled. Some came in covered wagons, but the poorest came with handcarts, 2-wheeled carts that families pulled by hand across the plains, carrying everything they owned. The handcart companies are legendary in Mormon history. Some made it successfully, others faced disaster. In 1856, the Willie and Martin handcart companies left too late in the season. Early winter storms caught them in Wyoming. With inadequate clothing and supplies, pulling handcarts through snow, they suffered catastrophic losses. Over 200 people died of starvation, exposure, and freezing. Rescue parties from Salt Lake eventually reached them, but not before bodies were left frozen along the trail. Yet they kept coming. By 1860, over 40,000 Mormons had made the journey to Utah. Brigham Young organized the colonization of the entire territory with authoritarian efficiency. He sent groups to establish settlements, eventually over 300 towns across what would become Utah, Idaho, Nevada, Arizona, and surrounding states. Each settlement was planned: where the temple would go, where farms would be, how water would be distributed. It was one of the most successful colonization efforts in American history, and Brigham ruled it all as a theocrat. Utah Territory was supposed to have a territorial governor appointed by the federal government, and technically Brigham Young was that governor. But he was also the prophet of the church. Religious and political authority were completely merged. If you weren't Mormon in Utah Territory, you had no political power. The church owned most of the land, controlled the economy, and dictated how communities functioned. For a while, the isolation worked. The Mormons built their Zion, practiced polygamy openly, and lived by their own rules. But the isolation couldn't last forever. And when the federal government turned its attention to Utah, conflict was inevitable. The trouble came to a head in 1857. President James Buchanan, hearing reports of Mormon defiance of federal law and Brigham Young's authoritarian rule, decided to assert federal control. He replaced Brigham as territorial governor and sent 2,500 federal troops to Utah to install the new governor and enforce federal authority. This became known as the Utah War, though it was more of a standoff than a war. Brigham Young declared martial law and called out the Nauvoo Legion, now reorganized as Utah's militia. He prepared for armed resistance. Mormon militia harassed the approaching federal troops, burning supply wagons and stampeding livestock, delaying their advance. Brigham preached defiance from the pulpit. He talked about defending their religion, about God protecting them, about the persecutions they'd endured in Missouri and Illinois. The rhetoric was apocalyptic. Some feared another Haun's Mill massacre, but this time with a federal army involved. The atmosphere in Utah was tense, paranoid, and violent, and it was in this atmosphere that the worst atrocity in Mormon history occurred. On September 7th, 1857, a wagon train of immigrants from Arkansas, the Baker-Fancher Party, passed through southern Utah on their way to California. They were at a place called Mountain Meadows, a valley used as a rest stop on the Old Spanish Trail. Over the next several days, local Mormon militia and their Paiute Indian allies laid siege to the wagon train. On September 11th, under a flag of truce, the militia convinced the emigrants to surrender their weapons, promising them safe passage. The emigrants, men, women, and children, came out unarmed. Then the Mormons systematically murdered them. The men were separated and shot. The women and older children were killed with knives and guns. Approximately 120 people were slaughtered. Only 17 small children, too young to testify about what happened, were spared and later returned to Arkansas families. This was not spontaneous mob violence. This was an organized military action by men in positions of authority. John D. Lee, a local Mormon leader and adopted son of Brigham Young, led the militia. Other prominent Mormons participated. Why did they do it? The reasons are complex. The wagon train had traveled through Utah during this period of extreme tension. Some immigrants may have been hostile or provocative. There are disputed accounts of insults and threats. There were rumors, possibly false, that some of these immigrants had participated in persecutions of Mormons in Missouri years earlier. The atmosphere of war with the federal government created paranoia. Brigham Young's blood atonement rhetoric created a culture where violence against enemies seemed justified. Whether Brigham Young directly ordered the massacre is still debated. A messenger rode to Salt Lake City to ask what to do about the wagon train. Young sent a message back saying to let them pass unmolested. But that message arrived too late. The massacre had already occurred. Some historians believe local leaders acted on their own initiative. Others believe they understood what Young wanted, even without explicit orders. What's not debatable is that Brigham Young and the church covered it up. They blamed it entirely on the Paiutes. They intimidated witnesses into silence. They destroyed evidence. For nearly 20 years, no one was prosecuted. Finally, in 1875, federal pressure forced action. John D. Lee was arrested, tried, and convicted. In 1877, he was taken back to Mountain Meadows and executed by firing squad. the only person ever punished for the massacre. On the execution ground, his last words included, "I have been sacrificed in a cowardly, dastardly manner." He claimed he was a scapegoat, that he'd acted under orders from church authorities. The church denied responsibility for 150 years. Only in 2007 did the LDS Church president, Gordon B. Hinckley, acknowledge at the site that the responsibility for the massacre lies with the local leaders, not with the church hierarchy, not with Brigham Young's rhetoric and culture, with local leaders. The Utah War ended without major bloodshed, aside from Mountain Meadows. Federal troops eventually entered Salt Lake City peacefully. A compromise was reached. The new governor was installed, but Brigham remained as church president and retained effective control. The federal government had made its point about sovereignty, but they didn't push too hard. Not yet. But the conflict over polygamy was just beginning, and that battle would nearly destroy the church. Brigham Young led the Mormon Church for 33 years, from 1844 until his death in 1877. He didn't have Joseph's charisma or visionary creativity, but he was an effective administrator and an authoritarian leader. And he taught some doctrines that were radical even by Mormon standards, some of which the church has since disavowed. The Adam God doctrine is the most bizarre. Brigham taught in multiple sermons in the Salt Lake Tabernacle that Adam, the Adam from the Garden of Eden, was actually God the Father, not symbolically but literally. Adam was God, he came to earth with one of his wives, Eve, they produced children, and Adam was the God who was worshipped by their descendants. More than that, Brigham taught that Adam was the literal father of Jesus Christ, both physically and spiritually. In an 1852 sermon, Brigham stated it plainly. When our father Adam came into the Garden of Eden, he came into it with a celestial body and brought Eve, one of his wives, with him. He is our Father and our God, and the only God with whom we have to do. This directly contradicted what Joseph Smith had taught and what the Book of Mormon said about God. It confused even faithful Mormons at the time. When Brigham taught this, people in the congregation looked at each other in bewilderment. Some openly questioned it, but Brigham insisted it was true. He taught it publicly for years, and it became part of the temple ceremony under his direction. The modern LDS Church disavows the Adam God theory. They call it Brigham's speculation or opinion, even though he taught it from the pulpit as doctrine and incorporated it into temple rituals. They claim he was speaking as a man, not as a prophet, even though he was literally standing in the tabernacle speaking to the church membership as their prophet and president. This raises an uncomfortable question for Mormons. If the prophet can teach false doctrine as revelation for decades, how do you know current prophets aren't doing the same? How do you distinguish between a prophet speaking as a prophet and a prophet speaking as a man when he's standing at the pulpit claiming to teach truth? Then there was blood atonement. Brigham taught that some sins were so serious that Christ's atonement on the cross wasn't sufficient to cover them. For these sins, murder certainly, but also adultery and apostasy, the sinner's own blood had to be shed to atone. Not just capital punishment administered by civil authority, but actual religious execution for sins like leaving the church or sexual transgression. Brigham said explicitly, "There are sins that men commit for which they cannot receive forgiveness in this world or in that which is to come. And if they had their eyes open to see their true condition, they would be perfectly willing to have their blood spilt upon the ground, that the smoke thereof might ascend to heaven as an offering for their sins." He went further, suggesting that true love would mean helping someone atone for their sin by shedding their blood. I could refer you to plenty of instances where men have been righteously slain in order to atone for their sins. This is loving our neighbor as ourselves. If he needs help, help him. And if he wants salvation, and it is necessary to spill his blood on the earth in order that he may be saved, spill it. Whether this was ever actually practiced is hotly debated. Some historians believe that some mysterious murders in early Utah were blood atonement killings, people who disappeared or were found dead under suspicious circumstances after committing adultery or leaving the church. Others say it was just rhetoric, meant to terrify people into obedience, but never actually carried out as religious practice. What's not debatable is that the doctrine was taught publicly and created a culture of fear. People knew that their prophet believed their blood should be spilled for certain sins. Whether or not it was literally practiced, the threat was real in people's minds. Utah's choice of execution method, death by firing squad, has been linked to blood atonement theology. The idea was that the condemned's blood would be spilled on the ground, fulfilling the requirement. Utah was one of the last states to allow firing squad executions, only removing it as an option in 2004. But the most enduring and damaging of Brigham's doctrines was the priesthood and temple ban on black members. Brigham Young taught that black people were cursed with dark skin because of actions in the pre-mortal life. According to Mormon theology, all humans existed as spirits before birth in a pre-mortal realm. There was a war in heaven between Christ and Satan over the plan of salvation. Brigham taught that black people had been less valiant in that war. They hadn't fought strongly enough on Christ's side. As punishment, they were born with dark skin and denied the priesthood. He also connected it to the biblical curse of Cain, who murdered his brother Abel. In Brigham's words, Cain slew his brother. Cain might have been killed, and that would have put a termination to that line of human beings. This was not to be, and the Lord put a mark upon him, which is the flat nose and black skin. But Brigham went even further with his racism. He taught that interracial marriage was so sinful it deserved the death penalty. Shall I tell you the law of God in regard to the African race? If the white man who belongs to the chosen seed mixes his blood with the seed of Cain, the penalty, under the law of God, is death on the spot. This will always be so. This wasn't just denying black men the priesthood, which in Mormonism is necessary for the highest salvation and exaltation. This was teaching that interracial marriage should be punished by death. This was declaring that black people were inherently inferior, cursed by God, and unworthy of the same spiritual blessings as white members. Under Brigham's leadership and the policy he established, black members couldn't hold the priesthood, couldn't participate in temple ordinances, couldn't be sealed to their families for eternity, and couldn't achieve the highest degree of heaven. At best, Mormon theology taught they could be servants to white Mormon families in the afterlife. This policy would last until 1978, well into the civil rights era, long after it was morally indefensible. We'll talk more about that later. But it originated with Brigham Young, and it caused immeasurable harm to black members and to the church's moral standing. And then there was polygamy. Under Brigham, plural marriage went from a secret practice among the elite to public doctrine required for exaltation. In Utah, far from federal oversight and public scrutiny, the Mormons openly practiced polygamy. In 1852, Apostle Orson Pratt gave a sermon in the Salt Lake Tabernacle, publicly announcing and defending the practice. He argued from the Bible. Abraham, Jacob, David, Solomon all had multiple wives. He argued it was necessary for exaltation, the highest degree of heaven. The sermon was published and distributed. The secret was out. Polygamy became a public badge of righteousness. The more wives a man had, the more righteous and prosperous he was considered. Church leaders competed in their plural marriages. It became part of the social structure of Mormon Utah. Brigham Young himself married 55 women. 55. He had 56 children. Some of his wives were young, very young. Some were already married to other men and were sealed to Brigham while maintaining their legal marriages. His family situation was extraordinarily complex. For the women involved, polygamy was often miserable. Diaries and letters from plural wives describe jealousy, heartbreak, poverty, because resources were spread thin across multiple families, and loneliness. But questioning polygamy was questioning God's revealed will. Women who struggled with it were told they lacked faith, that they were being tested. The federal government was appalled. Polygamy became the defining issue of Utah territory. Northerners who had fought to end slavery now turned their attention to ending what they called the twin relics of barbarism: slavery and polygamy. Congress passed law after law attempting to stop the practice. The Mormons ignored them, claiming religious freedom. The conflict would escalate for decades. But Brigham wouldn't live to see its resolution. He died in 1877, still practicing polygamy, still preaching his doctrines, still ruling Utah as a theocrat. His legacy is complicated. He was an effective colonizer and administrator. He built a thriving community in a desert. He kept the Mormon Church together after Joseph's death and grew it substantially. Pioneer Day in Utah celebrates his "this is the place" moment, but he also taught doctrines the Church now disavows. He established racist policies that caused immense harm. He created a culture of authoritarian control and blood atonement that terrorized people. He covered up the Mountain Meadows massacre. The question Mormons have to grapple with is this: if Brigham Young was a prophet of God, why did God let him teach false doctrine for 33 years? And if he wasn't reliably speaking for God, why should anyone trust that current prophets are? But the Church's biggest crisis was still ahead. The battle over polygamy was about to reach a breaking point. Thank you for listening. This is such a deep topic, I had to break it into 2 parts. I am releasing part 2 with this.